Well, good day and grace and peace to all who've tuned in today to another episode of Absolutely Necessary. I am so incredibly excited and so thankful to each of you for your support, your comments and your input, your questions, your interaction, your engagement. These things have been a blessing to me and our media team and our church as a whole. I'm grateful to you. Out of all the content creators and places that you could go and spend your time with, for you to do it with us here at Absolute Necessary in the House of Hope, I'm grateful, and so I'm thankful. I want you to make sure you follow us on all our social media platforms. That's House of Hope Atlanta there on YouTube. If you're not following, you can follow me and subscribe to my channel, Dewey Smith TV on YouTube as well, and all the social media platforms, so thank you. Also, if you're watching and you know you want somebody to be a part of a very thoughtful and an absolute necessary conversation, won't you like, subscribe, and share this link with somebody? I really, really believe it's going to be thought-provoking and maybe cause us to be introspective, to be better citizens, and to be a part of what Dr. King called that beloved community. Although we are, almost 60 years removed from Dr. King's death, the whole concept of a beloved community has never been more necessary than it is right now. In this world where it seems that things are filled with burdens and filled with hate and filled with anxiety and stress and violence, if there was ever a time when we need to have a more beloved community, it's certainly right now. And when you look at the events that are happening just in our country, the things that are happening in terms of executions, of murder, of school shootings, of, my goodness, even, college students being found hanging from trees. When you notice this whole concept about what's free speech, a lot of things we talked about last week, it's really heartbreaking. And so we need a more beloved community. And one of the conversations that is very recurring, and as a religion and philosophy major, I spent a lot of time really trying to understand how religion impacts the world. But now it has become more apparent that a lot of people don't really understand about how American government works and the role of faith. And people sometimes see through a very, very, Paul says we see through a glass darkly. And I believe a lot of us, maybe we didn't pay attention during elementary civics class. Maybe we've forgotten about it's only a bill. Yes, it's only a bill. Some of you remember that commercial from ABC years ago about how bills become laws, and many of us probably fell asleep during the American government when we talked about the American Constitution, the American Revolution, the framers of the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. Many of us, and the First Amendment, many of us really don't know about how these things came to be. And we're living in a time right now where I'm very, very concerned because Christian nationalism is on the rise. And I believe that we notice Project 25 and Project 30 that has been espoused by the UN. I believe what is happening right now, that democracy is really under siege in America. There is a plan and a plot in place that wants to replace the Constitution. For all intents and purposes, when you notice what happened a few days ago, even with Jimmy Kimmel, when the FCC is being threatened and a national network is being threatened by the executive office of government to withhold funding, and decisions are made that impact free speech. All of this has some theological complicity at its core. And it's very, very sad that Christian nationalism is on the rise, and it is a part of the kingdom. It is one of the kingdoms of Christian nationalism, the kingdom of finances and the wealthy, the different kingdoms that are at work and complicit in adhering to and bolstering the empire. And the empire is the empire of money. I think it's the empire of white supremacy and greed and oppression and subjugation of people, which has been a European way for quite some time. And I'm really concerned that people don't understand when they say we want America to be Christian and run by Christian principles, and America is a Christian nation. I really believe we don't understand that in detail because we see through a glass darkly. One of our media consultants said to me, sometimes we only see the back of the head of somebody in terms of religion. We never see the face view. And today I want to give you a very up close and personal view when we talk about religion and the Christian faith and why it is almost impossible. And not why it is impossible, but it is impossible when you think about merging Christian belief or any type of faith or theological presupposition or construct into public policy for into America, because it doesn't go with the whole framing of the nation. When you think about the First Amendment, which promises citizens of America the freedom of religion and the freedom from religion, those framers and those framers of the Constitution, our forefathers, wanted to escape the tyranny that was associated with religion and that toxic merger and that marriage between toxic theology and political expediency. It could create issues that are almost irreparable. And so the framers did not want the country and the polity to be affected by any national established religion. And that's the first line, really one of the first lines in the First Amendment. There will be no nationally established religion, because we don't want people to be subjugated by people who have different subjective opinions in terms of interpretations of religion. And so you have the freedom of religion and the freedom from religion. And so I want to say this word to people who are just so emboldened by what they think is their Christian dogma, that they want to make sure it is eaten in detail and in whole by everybody in America, that doesn't line up with the 250 plus year history of our country. And so when you say, I want Christian nationalism, or I want faith to be the source of polity and government and laws for all American citizens, let me just give you some details about that, just to make sure you're on the same page. Well, first of all, when we talk about the Christian church as a whole, let's go back to the very beginning. And of course, Jesus prophesied in Matthew 16, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell should not prevail against it. And many of us see the church being born on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. We believe that Luke wrote the book of Acts between AD 60 and AD 62. But there's a bit of inconclusivity about when do you date Pentecost? What is the actual date of Pentecost? More than likely it was before 62 AD, but there's uncertainty about when did Pentecost officially take place. Was it 35 AD? Was it 50 days? And so, if we go with Pentecost and that it happened 50 days after Jesus was killed, so we can say 40 AD perhaps. And so there's a bit of uncertainty about putting an exact time on that. But I will say that if the church is born on Pentecost, which we have a bit of inconclusivity, as I said, about determining the actual date of it, let's just say 40 AD. We do know that it was in 42 AD when St. Mark established the first church. The first church was called the Coptic or the Orthodox Church that's there in Africa. And so 42 AD, we can date the church, the Orthodox and the Coptic Church being begun, and it commenced there in Africa. To this day, you have the Ethiopian Bible, which is the oldest Bible in the world, has more books into the King James Version, which was translated from the Tyndale version of the Bible, but that Ethiopian Bible comes out of that context. And there we also can trace the Ethiopian eunuch to the Coptic Church from Acts chapter 8. And so St. Mark establishes the first Orthodox church, or the Coptic Church, there in Africa in 42 AD. And so when we come out of that, then we see that the church has some schisms in it. One of the early schisms of the first century was a schism called Gnosticism. Gnosticism coming from the word gnosis, or gnosis, which means knowledge. So there was this overemphasis on knowledge, where the Gnostics even believed inevitably that, they worshiped knowledge in so much that they believed that because of their own knowledge, for them, Jesus Christ could not have come in the flesh. And so the Gnostics inevitably proclaimed that Jesus Christ never died because matter or the atmosphere is evil. And since matter or the atmosphere is evil, if Jesus Christ had come in the flesh, then he too would have been evil based upon his contamination with the atmosphere. And so the Gnostics taught that Jesus never really came in flesh, that he had this optical illusion of a body. And then after you get Gnosticism, we come to what's called Docetism. And Docetism took it a step further, which talked about it being a mirage, or Jesus Christ who may have come and perhaps some divinity ascended on him at his baptism. but that divinity left him. And as he started his ministry, and when he died, and then that divinity returns unto him later on when he's resurrected. And so we have issues from St. Mark starting the church with Gnosticism. Then you get Docetism. And then we get Cerinthianism, which was also a combination of those three. And so these three sects all originated after the start of the church in terms of St. Mark doing that in 42 AD. And so we get from these issues, and then once we get to the 4th century is when we get to Constantine, the emperor, who, because of political expediency, when that first statewide religion was instituted there, that's when Catholicism was born, at the behest and at the request and at the demand of Constantine. And so the Edict of Milan is signed around 312, 313 AD, and basically it was about trying to bring peace between two kingdoms. There was a wedding going forth between two kingdoms, and people didn't want these kingdoms to be combined. And so as a consequence, the Edict of Milan was signed by Constantine that instituted Christianity or Catholicism as a state religion, really only for the purposes of political expediency. It was not because Constantine had a love for God or a love for Jesus Christ. It was just to make the constituency become more calm. It was almost as if religion was established just to make sure that the people can be controlled. And although here we are, almost 1,800 years away from Constantine and the Edict of Milan, in many instances, religion still is being used as a system of oppression and control of people to this very day. And so it was Constantine who institutes Christianity or Catholicism, which comes about in the 4th century after the signing of the Edict of Milan. But then we have some challenges about 12 years later because of something that's called Arianism. Well, Arius comes on the scene and he declares that Jesus Christ is not God in flesh, that he's not the same as God, that he is like God. And so they have to have a first ecumenical council in a place called Nicaea to correct what they thought the teachings of Arius was, who taught that Jesus was of a similar substance and not as a like substance. And the whole church divided over something called what he called homoiousios. The word homo meaning same, the prefix, the suffix meaning ousios, meaning essence. And Arius put one Greek alphabet, one Greek letter in between homoousios. It was homoiousios, the Greek letter iota, which is a negation of the suffix ousios. And it is interesting that the whole church was divided because Arius says he is homoiousios, of a like substance, and the other says he's homoousios, same substance. The thing that separated the church, the thing that almost separated them, caused that first schism, was one Greek letter, iota. Iota was placed in the middle of homoousios that gave Arius homoiousios, and the whole church almost broke up. The whole church was in turmoil over one Greek letter, iota. It's very interesting because whenever you put iota, I in the middle, homoousios, because of one Greek letter, iota in the middle, the church separated. Isn't it amazing that even to this very day, when you put I in the middle, how things mess up? What happens when you put I in the middle of the relationship? I in the middle of your political presuppositions? I in the middle of your agenda? It's funny that you can't even get the word sin without putting I in the middle. You can't even get the word pride without putting that Greek letter iota, I, in the middle. And to this very day, here we are, 1,800 years after Nicaea. But yet to the 1,700 years after Nicaea, but what you find happening in this world is that I is in the middle. I, my position, I am a Republican. I am a Democratic. I don't like the Great Replacement theory. I. The same iota that was present there in 325 AD at Nicaea is still causing issues in the church today. We have a president. Congress people. I is a thing that's caused these difficulties. And so they refuted the teachings of Arius, and then around 381 AD, we get to something called Constantinople. And now we move from Arius to a guy whose name was Apollinaris. And Apollinarianism suggested that Jesus Christ was too divine to be human. Arius says he's too human to be divine. Apollinaris says he's too divine to be human. And so now here we are in Constantinople for the Second Ecumenical Council with Arianism, with Apollinarianism, to try to bring about what's called a hypostatic union, to ratify and affirm that Christ is both divine and human. which I think is very significant because it is all to this day, that's some divinity in us. But sometimes the divinity in us doesn't allow us to see the humanity in others. And since sometimes the humanity of us is disrespected by the others because of they feel they're divine and supernatural. And so it's amazing that the same spirits that were at work in 325 AD that caused Nicaea and 381 that caused Constantinople are the same spirits that are at work with us. Too many of us think we're so divine that we disrespect the humanity of others. And some of us are too human that we don't realize that we're not less than anybody else. Subjugation is still happening in this world. And so because of these issues, there were 7 major ecumenical councils, from Nicaea to Constantinople to Chalcedon. And so 7 different councils, again, trying to figure out how do we ratify theology and appropriate that into the lives of people. And so this was happening over and over and over again. And so the Catholic Church had been the source of strength and power. The Catholic Church was the source of dominance. And so after the scriptures was translated into Latin, we get what's called the Vulgate, which is the Latin version of the Bible. And the Catholic Church was one of the proponents of wickedness and empire. The wealthiest church in the world, empire, in terms of influence and policy. It was the Catholic Church. Supporting slavery initially, it was the Catholic Church. Many of the atrocities that were committed, the control that went to the Vatican, even in terms of organized crime, suggests dealt with the whole role of that Catholic Church, even in terms of the role of organized crime. And to the point where between the 12th and the 15th centuries, the Catholic Church was of sorts where they began to do something called the selling of indulgences, which was basically a fundraising way of making money off of people. And what the selling of indulgences was in order to get prayer, in order to get atonement, that a person had to find a local priest and go to the priest to admit what your maladies and what your sins were. And when you went to that priest to admit what your sins were, they had an a la carte list of prayers, which simply meant this. If I went to the priest and said, I cussed somebody out at work this week, they had a charge on the a la carte list of what that prayer would cost you to get prayer for cussing out your coworker. If you got drunk, there was an a la carte list that also had what the cost for that prayer would be. If you got drunk, cussed your coworker out, and cheated on your wife, that was a cost for that prayer as well. And so they would sell indulgences for the purposes of their own power, taking advantage of the people because the people didn't know any better. And they did not want the Bible translated into any other languages because that kept the people ignorant and kept the people at the behest and under control and influence of the Catholic Church. In so much that when people tried to translate the Bible into different languages just so people could understand, from the Vulgate into a language of a person's own ethnicity. In the case of William Tyndale, they had him killed and burned at stake simply because he wanted the gospel to get other places. And so this was happening in Catholicism up to the 15th, 16th centuries. And then a man by the name of Martin Luther. Martin Luther comes on the scene out of Germany, and he is sick and tired of the control and the domination of the Catholic Church. And Martin Luther comes on the scene, and he writes the 95 Theses that he hung on the church doors there in Gutenberg, trying to get them to know that people no longer needed a priest and have to pay for prayers. And because of Martin Luther starts something called the Protestant Reformation. And it was through Martin Luther, who also wrote that great hymn of the Church, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," of Fichtenberg was a German translation of that song. "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing." It was Martin Luther who was the one who actually ushered in the Protestant Reformation, who brought in the doctrine about the priesthood of all believers. And so now we are Protestants. And how interesting it is that here we are still protesting in faith, protesting between Christian nationalism and the evangelical movement, protesting between denominations. Our whole Protestant idea started, that's where we get the word protest from. It's called the Protestant Reformation. And my goodness, we've been protesting for 400 years. And Martin Luther also had a subsequent disciple who was a scholar of Geneva and a protege of Erasmus. His name was John Calvin. And John Calvin comes on the scene after Martin Luther starts the Lutheran Church. And so I want you to just follow this journey with me. We get Catholicism. From Catholicism, Martin Luther gets mad. He starts the Lutheran Church, Lutheranism. John Calvin, who's Luther's protege, comes, he gets mad, and he has some qualms with what his mentee taught, Martin Luther, and John Calvin starts what we call Calvinism, or the Reformed Church. And so the Reformed Church comes from John Calvin. John Calvin comes out of Martin Luther. Well, out of the Reformed Church and out of John Calvin was going on at the same time, there's a king in England whose name is Henry VIII. Well, Henry VIII has some issues with Catholicism because they won't give him communion. And because of some of the choices he made, he in England cannot get communion. And so instead of him trying to get the Catholic Church to give him communion, what Henry VIII does is he starts his own church. He calls it the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. So I want you to just follow with me. So the Catholicism is taking advantage of people by selling indulgences, keeping the people dumb to the extent where they even kill people to try to translate the scriptures. Martin Luther comes on the scene and starts the Protestant Reformation in defiance by writing 95 Theses that hung on the church at Gutenberg. He has a disciple whose name is John Calvin, who inevitably has problems with Lutheranism and the Lutheran Church, so he starts Calvinism, or the Reformed Church. At the same time, Henry VIII can't get communion from the Catholic Church. Some say because of sin, some say because he wasn't paying enough money. So he starts the Church of England, which is also the Anglican Church. Well, at the same time, in Scotland, you have some group who's called, who upset what's happening with the Catholic Church, that they start what's called the Presbyterian Church. That starts in Scotland. Well, at the same time this is happening, now settlers want to come to America. And so the settlers who come to America from England, they come here under the name of the Church of England. But when they get here to America after the American Revolution, and they see that they have been given taxation without representation, these settlers who came to America, being led by Catholicism, now they get mad what's happening back there in England. And so instead of them keeping the name after the American Revolution, now they adopt the name Episcopalians. So the Episcopalians came from the Church of England, who came from Europe, who got upset after the American Revolution that they were being dominated, so they start the Episcopal Church. Are y'all tracking with me, or do you need a cigarette? I think I need a Black and Miles, and I don't even smoke now. And we just now in the 1600s. And so at the same time this is happening, now we get John Wesley, who comes as an Anglican. With John Wesley, who has a brother whose name is Charles Wesley, John Wesley gets mad at the Anglicans, and so he moves from the Anglicans, he starts what's called Methodism. And so the Methodist comes from John Wesley, who came from the Anglicans who came from the Church of England, the Church of England that was started by Henry VIII, who got mad with Catholicism because he was not able to get communion. Are y'all tracking with me, or do you need something? Are you still with me? And so these are the things that are happening. And so what happens at the same time that John Wesley starts the Methodist Church, because he's mad with the Anglicans, we get another guy whose name is John Smith. Well, John Smith is also an Anglican. He too gets upset with the Methodists, so he starts the church called the Baptist Church. And so the Baptist Church comes from John Smith, who's also one of the proponents with Roger Williams. And then when the Baptists also move here to America, well, let me not track myself. And so before we get to that point, we see that once the people come here to this country, by the way, many of our forefathers were Anglicans or deists. George Washington was an Anglican. His wife was an Anglican from the Church of England, but they also supported slavery. William and Mary, there in Virginia. Virginia Theological Seminary, right near Mount Vernon. All of this was started with slave money. It's been said that George Washington even had teeth that was in his mouth, that he took teeth from a slave. So George Washington, the one that we venerate, the one that we lift, the one that we celebrate, it's amazing how our president has now removed all Black history artifacts from federal museums and places that are federally funded. Doesn't want to see the image of slavery, but yet he has not removed George Washington. So it's okay to remember George Washington. It's okay to remove Confederate money, to rename army bases and military bases in the name of Confederate soldiers. We will still memorialize them, but at the same time, we want to whitewash and erase slavery from our history. You can't erase slavery from the history, not as long as you got George Washington, who had teeth of a slave in his mouth. You can't erase slavery from history when Thomas Jefferson had 300 slaves and even had children by some, Sally Hemings. So it's difficult to erase slavery because it's a part of who we are. You don't get the country without slavery. And so what happens, you got all these different movements going on. At the same time, let's leave from D.C. and Virginia, because what happened when the Europeans came here, the settlers came here, they sent the aristocrats to Virginia. Most of the aristocrats, the best and brightest, went to Virginia and to coastal Carolina. Those are the first two places where slaves primarily came in Jamestown, 1619, and Charleston. So the aristocratic Europeans went to Virginia and Charleston, the coastal areas. The thugs, the European thugs, the European mean folks, the lowlifes, they sent them to the South, to Georgia, to Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. And this is the reason why slavery was more diabolic or more cruel in the southern areas, because the white European thugs were sent to the southern areas, whereas the aristocratic Europeans and aristocratic people who came were sent to the northern areas. And so you get some who moved to the north, the Puritans are at the north. You get others who are at the north, the more well-to-do in weather areas, and those who were dealing with heat, they sent them down here. And that's why we had the most atrocities committed in the southern slavery, chattel slavery, because the thugs, and I use that word intentionally, the thugs, the hoodlums, the scumbags were sent to the south from England, from Britain. That's why things were more difficult here in the south than in northern areas. And so while these things are happening in the South and coastal Carolina and Virginia at the same time, now let's go to Philadelphia. While we're in Philadelphia, the Methodists are there in Philadelphia, and you got the white Methodists and the black Methodists together. Well, the black Methodists are tired of their separation and the oppression and them being mistreated there. And so out of the Methodist church there, I believe it was St. George's there, the Methodist church there in Philadelphia, is around 1794, that Richard Allen decides to walk away from Methodism and starts the AME Church, along with Absalom Jones and Morris Brown. And so the oldest denomination for African Americans in America is the AME Church. And so you have Baptists and American Baptists. In the north, you have Anabaptists. The Anabaptists in the north, and the Anabaptists differ from the American Baptists on the Southern Baptist because the Anabaptists were those who were about the abolition of slavery. Are you with me? And so now we get the AME Church that started with Richard Allen in 1794, Mother Bethel AME Church that still exists today. Well, a few years later, some of the AMEs get mad, and so they get mad with some of the political stuff that was happening there, and they start another church called the AME Zion, the AMEZ. And then from the AME Zion, now you get the CME. Are y'all with me? And so at the same time, you got John Smith, who's with the Baptists. Now we're in the 1860s, and now you got the Northern Baptists who are about the abolition of slavery, and you got the Southern Baptists who want to continue to maintain slavery because it's the thing that allows them to have their wealth. They own slaves, and so what happens as a consequence, a war breaks out in 1861 to 1865 called the Civil War. And at issue with the Civil War, the North against the South, the Union against the Confederacy, was his whole issue at its core, slavery. And guess who the main group was that was for maintaining slavery? The Southern Baptists. It was so difficult that the Baptists split over the issue of slavery. May I add, parenthetically, that Robert E. Lee also was an Anglican, Alexander Cromwell, and so many others. And so you see how Southern Baptists, they were the ones who split from the North because they fought vociferously against the abolition of slavery. And so now we see these things happening. And so now you got Southern Baptists, Northern Baptists, American Baptists, Anabaptists. And at the same time, now we get Methodism. You got the Methodists, you got John Wesley and Charles Wesley, also who are part of that whole movement, right? So our whole Reformation starts from there. Well, at the same time, there's a lady whose name is, a fellow whose name is William Miller. And William Miller comes on the scene, and he starts something called the Adventist Church. So now we go to the Adventist Church. Well, William Miller, he was so impactful that a woman whose name was Ellen White, she agreed with him that she started something called the Seventh-day Adventist. So you get Ellen White, who agrees with Miller. You get the Adventist, Seventh-day Adventist. Well, then you got Charles Russell going on the scene. Well, Charles Russell, disagrees with the Adventists that came from Ellen White who agreed with William Miller, and Charles Russell starts something called the Jehovah's Witness. So the Jehovah's Witness comes from Charles Russell, who's the offspring of Ellen White, who's the offspring of William Miller. Well, then after that, you get somebody whose name is Joseph Smith. Well, Joseph Smith doesn't like what the Methodists are teaching, so he starts something called the Church of the Latter-day of Jesus Christ. We also call them Mormons. Also, let me add, the Mormons also taught that black people were cursed by God. Up until 50 years ago, they were taught that black people were cursed by God. Our skin color is cursed, but they didn't start that, because to this very day, there are white Christians who make black Christians believe, according to Genesis 9, based upon what they call the curse of Ham, that when Ham was cursed, and Ham was never cursed, it was really his grandson in Genesis 9, and the curse was not from God, it was from Noah. The curse was not blackness, but the curse was that Noah's grandson would be a servant to his brothers. But people believe to this very day, based upon Genesis 9, that there's a curse of Ham. That was also in the Dake's Study Bible. One of the Bible commentators was sure to include in his commentary notes, the Dake's, D-A-K-E-S. Check me out if you think I'm lying. To this very day, if you read that Genesis 9 passage, verses 9 through 25, they suggest that blacks are cursed by God. Why do they do this? Because to demonize blacks, to dehumanize blacks, allowed them and black skin, made them feel better about chattel slavery and the subjugation. To dehumanize blacks and to demonize blacks and dark skin made them feel better about their mistreatment and about their own sense of insecurity and inadequacy. And so to this very day, people still are demonizing skin color. I talked about this last week, how some even black people are now talking about when you speak against injustices, that's the idolization of your skin. It's strange that they speak against what they call the idolization of their skin from blacks, but never talk about the demonization of our skin that came from whites, Dakes, and so many others. To this very day, do you know that within the last 40 years that Kenneth Hagin taught that interracial marriage was wrong? Within the last 30 years, that's what Kenneth Hagin, one of the leading Word of Faith teachers, taught, that interracial marriage was wrong and a sin. It was so bad that the late Dr. Fred Price taught a year-long series on racism in defiance and in protest of what Kenneth Hagin taught. Because to this day, people still believe that dark skin is bad. Up until the 60s in Virginia and Georgia, it was illegal for a black person to marry a white person. Why? Because you have biblical credence and biblical texts that were used not just to condone slavery, but also to suggest that you should not marry a person of dark skin because their skin is cursed by God. You see how the Bible can be used to affect policy? And while I'm on that, let me also add that some people believe that it's okay for a grown man to marry children, because we saw that happening in the Bible. We saw it happen with Joseph and Mary, the earthly mother of Jesus. And isn't it strange how people in government will fight so hard, our president, to fight to silence and to punish Jimmy Kimmel and others for speaking out against Charlie Kirk? But to this day, we're protecting pedophiles, and the Epstein files have not been released to this very day. So why is it that we can fight to protect pedophiles, and people sometimes use the Bible even as justification for child marriage to this very day? I digress. Let me get back to my point. And so Joseph Smith comes on the scene and says that black skin is cursed, and Mormonism, that came from Methodism. Well, at the same time, we get now to what I want to call the Pentecostal church. Because now we're in the 19th century, some folks have gotten mad with, of course, the Methodists and the Baptists. And so a huge thing took place in the 20th century in a place called Azusa Street. And what happened at Azusa Street, Williams J. Seymour and others who were Pentecostals, they come on the scene, and a revival takes place that dealt with the movement of the Holy Spirit, with glossolalia, the speaking of unknown tongues, which was different from Baptist or Methodism. And from the Azusa Street, we get what's called the Church of God in Christ, and even more references of Pentecostalism. And we get a guy whose name is C.H. Mason, who comes along the scene, who starts what's called the Church of God in Christ. Originally, C.H. Mason had all people of all ilks, all ethnicities who were present because of the power that they experienced on Azusa Street. But a little while later, you had some of the white Pentecostals who got tired of being up under a black Pentecostal leader. And so because the white Pentecostals did not want to be a part of the Black Church of God in Christ organization, an offshoot of that took place that's called the Assemblies of God. And so it's interesting that in Philadelphia, Richard Allen left the white church because the whites didn't want him there. But after Azusa, the white Assemblies of God left the church Kojic because they didn't want to be led by a black person. And to this day, it's easier, I believe, psychologically for us, for a black person to be led by a white person than it is for a white person to be led by a black person. And this is why a lot of this stuff's happening with Trump now. A lot of people lost their minds when President Obama was made president because they felt like something was taken from them. Hence, we want to take our country back. And so what happens, and so you have some other Baptists who comes on the scene, didn't like what was happening in Baptists, and they didn't want to be Pentecostals, so they started something called the evangelical movement. Well, the evangelicals who started had a group that didn't like them, so some left them. They were called the born-again movement. And so what is happening, we see this history. So now you get the National Baptist USA who gets started, and the National Baptist is the first black Baptist organization in America. But a few years later, they have a split over Sunday school publishing material, and now they start an organization called the National Baptist of America. So now the Baptists are doing the same thing what we saw happening with Luther, with Calvin. And so now you got the National Baptist USA, the National Baptist of America, that split because who was going to control the Sunday school publishing information? Well, now we get to the 1960s, and we got the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, who are led by a guy whose name was Dr. J.H. Jackson, who pastored the Olivet Baptist Church there in Chicago, Illinois. One of the leading voices, most powerful preachers of the 20th century, J.H. Jackson. Well, J.H. Jackson was black in body and in preaching, but really he was a tool of Mayor Daley there in Chicago, who had significant hate for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And because he was more conservative, almost felt like the white man's ice was colder. But he was such a powerful force as a leader of the National Baptist Convention that he refused to let Dr. King and anything progressive come on the scene. Dr. J.H. Jackson there in Chicago hated Dr. King so much that most people don't know this. Dr. King's movement in Chicago never took off. Dr. King even moved to Chicago for a while to try to get his civil rights movement and his work off the ground. It couldn't happen because of the duality and because of the teamwork with Mayor Daley and Dr. J.H. Jackson. That's how diabolical it was. At the same time, there was a preacher there in Chicago, the late, great Pastor Clay Evans, who pastored the Fellowship Baptist Church that was started in 1950, who was in the process of building a new church. And Dr. Jackson gave a command to all Baptist preachers, do not let Martin Luther King Jr. come and speak in Chicago, Illinois. Well, Dr. Evans' church was growing significantly there in Chicago, growing so much that he had to build a new church. Well, Dr. Evans, who was a man's man, decided to do what he wanted to do, defy the decree of Dr. Jackson, defy the decree of Mayor Daley. And while they were in the middle of building a new church, you know what Dr. Jackson and Mayor Daley did? Called every lending institution in Chicago through the Midwest and demand that the building and construction loans be taken from them so that it cannot finish the task of building a sanctuary there at 45th and Princeton there in Chicago. That happened because of J.H. Jackson and because of Mayor Daley. You see? So please don't get it twisted. When people say things like, well, Charlie Kirk had black people who loved him. Well, we've always had Django. We've always had people who love Yessa Massa. We're sick boss. Just because a black person supports a white person, Harriet Tubman once said, how many slaves could I have freed if they didn't know that they were slaves? So just because a black person is a token, and I'm not saying this is true of all Republicans. That's not what I'm saying. We can have ideological differences. I'm just saying, don't use a black face to justify that a person is not a certain way because they believe it. No, we've always had people, what Malcolm X calls house Negroes and field Negroes. So just because you have a person who acts like Well, he couldn't have been racist because he has black people. I got black friends. That is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. And so J.H. Jackson was that guy. It got so bad in the National Baptist Convention in 1961 at one of their annual meetings that you had some proponents of Dr. Jackson who was conservative, and let's go backwards, and some of Dr. King's lieutenants who wanted to go forward. They got into a fight at the convention. The preachers got into a fight. You know what happened? One of the preachers threw another preacher off of a platform, and the preacher died there in Kansas City at a National Baptist Convention gathering. Our preacher was killed over the same issue of what's progressive and what's conservative. And as a consequence, Dr. King, Dr. T. Walker, Dr. Gardner Taylor, Dr. Bill Jones, Daddy King, and a host of others, Nelson Smith, they started something called the Progressive National Baptist Convention. That came across as a result of the fight that took place in 1961. And now we come to the scene, and now we have this new movement that is called Christian nationalism, that takes its roots in Aryanism, that takes its roots in the KKK. Please know the KKK was a Christian organization. Bull Connor was a deacon in his church. George Wallace, segregation now, segregation then, segregation forever, was also a Christian. But I just want to show you, and so now we have Christian nationalism, which is trying to espouse that we need a Christian doctrine and a Christian polity for the world. My question remains, which policy? Which doctrine? Are we going to use the one from St. Mark from 42 AD? Which Christian belief? Arianism? Which Christian belief? Gnosticism? Docetism? Cerinthianism? Which Christian belief? The Edict of Milan? Arianism? Apollinarianism? Nicaea? Constantinople? Ephesus? Chalcedon? Which Christian belief? What are we going to go by? Are we going by selling indulgences? Lutheranism? Calvinism? Anglicanism? Presbyterianism? Church of Scotland? Mormonism? Which Christian belief? Methodism? Baptist? Pentecostalism? Which Christian belief? Full gospel? Which Christian belief? Evangelicalism? Born again movement? Symbols of God? Kojic? Apostolic? Church of God in Christ? Church of God in Christ? Latter-day Saints? Church of God by prophecy? Fire baptized holiness? Which Christian belief? There are 40,000 Christian denominations alone. So whose policy do we implement? Are we going to implement polygamy, which is a theological construct taught in Mormonism? I'm sure there's some fellows who would say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. That's a good faith. I mean, which Christian belief are we going to go by? Who defines what is an objective view of Christianity? And this is why it's going to be nearly impossible, and not nearly impossible, to choose one set of beliefs for public policy for the entire whole of America. But secondly, it should not even be a fact because our framers of the Constitution did not want America to have a nationally established religion. They gave us the freedom of and freedom from religion. Stop trying to make America the kingdom of God. While America will have a king if we're not careful. Fascism is here. Free speech is only for those who agree with the president. But I want you to be encouraged. What do we do in the meantime? Believe what you believe as an American citizen. You and I have to stand before God as individuals. Make your own decisions. But I want you to know this, but we don't live our lives with no hope. Yes, things are bad. Yes, things are bleak. Yes, things are difficult. But I want to encourage you with this. As they make America great again, to take us back to what Charlie Kirk said was in the 40s were the best time for African Americans, that's what's happening now. That's what make America great again. And the next time you see somebody say make America great again, ask them, what period do you want to relive? Ask them, when was America great? That nostalgia means we want to go back to something. Ask them, what period do you want to go back to? Is that civil rights movement? Plessy versus Ferguson? Separate but equal? Jim Crow? Rosewood? Burning of Black Wall Street, Reconstruction. Ask them specifically, when was America great? And what period do you want to recapitulate? What period you want to go back to? Because when they think America was great for them, America was great for them when they had control. America was great for them when certain people couldn't vote. Now they're saying that women should not be able to vote. That's when America was great. To this very day, that's someone who's saying that women should be able to forget the suffrage movement and Susan B. Anthony. And so there are a lot of things that concern me about what's happening in our country. But I do know that this world, America is my citizenship, it is my residency. America is my residency, but my citizenship is in heaven, in the kingdom of God. And we have to draw on the strength of our ancestors. Those of us who don't like what's happening, got to realize it's not the first time we've dealt with wickedness. We've dealt with this diabolic complicity of theopolitical expediency. It's not new to us. It's not new to our ancestors. They came together, they fought, and it's not new to God. And while you're watching, I don't want to tell you all these things for you to be alarmed. I do want to be honest with you about the history of Christianity over the past 2,000 years, which is what I try to do today. We're going to always have difficulty understanding God because we see through a glass darkly. And whenever you try to engage in theological possibilities, it's going to be difficult because who really knows the mind of God? Doctrines and interpretations are always difficult. But what I want to tell you is this: Christ makes the difference. So whether it's Catholicism, whether you're trying to figure out if it's Protestantism, if it's Lutheranism, if it's Anglicanism, if it's Presbyterianism, if it's Baptist movement, Pentecostalism, if it's apostolicism, when you're trying to deal with all these realities, let me be clear for you. Only what you do for Christ will last. Most of these things that separate us have nothing to do with eternity. For me, Christ makes the difference, not these denominations. I promise you, that was not going to be a Pentecostal section or Baptist section or Methodist section in heaven. But blessed are the pure in heart, not the denominational in head. Now, the difference between the denominational in head and the pure in heart. And none but the pure in heart shall see God. My friend, Christ is the best thing ever happened to me. He's a liberator, he's an emancipator, he's a heart fixer, the old folks would say, and a mind regulator. And if you want to get more information, want to connect us, how do I learn more about Christ? Have a Christ consciousness. How do I allow what's happening? How do I embody the Spirit of Christ? So the liberation that Christ provides, I can have that. If that's you, there's a QR code on the screen now. I want you to scan that QR code. You say, I want to be baptized to experience that, to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. I want somebody to pray with me or explain to me how I can have a new life with Christ. That's you. You can scan that QR code on the screen, or you can call us, or you can text us rather at 678-201-1351. That's you. Call, text that number right now, or scan that QR code. Somebody's waiting right now to pray with you, to share with you how you can have your own encounter with Christ. You want to be baptized? Scan that code now. Connect with us right now. Text 678-201-1351 right now. Numbers on the screen. Last, as we close this episode of Absolutely Necessary, some of you have been blessed today, and I really wish I had more time. What I shared with you today is really a year-long course that I would teach in the seminary. So I tried to do it as quick as I could. But this is a whole year-long course, really, if not longer. But you've been blessed by it. You got information that you can apply to your life and share, and some things you're blessed by what you received today, and you want to bless the ministry and help us as we continue about bringing liberation to the world. And you want to bless the church, or you remember the church and you were not here this past Sunday for our Back to Church Sunday, but you want to give, I want you to go ahead now. There's a QR code with the methods of giving on the screen now. There's also a lower third. You give by text to give, by Cash App, by Zelle, by PayPal, give to the website. Even the P.O. box is on the address right now. And so if you've been blessed by today or been blessed by our ministry, want to support us, to help us to continue to bring you great content and great qualitative messaging, please right now do it. Be a blessing to the ministry. Ministry that is extensive is expensive. We got a lot of things we're trying to do. We need your support. If you're blessed by it, consider blessing the ministry right now. My time, my friend, my time is far spent now. But I want to leave you these words. Don't allow man's best interpretations about God, religion. Don't allow man's subjective views, their own personal biases about faith, necessitating the rise of 40,000 denominations that are Christian, make you believe that those things are the perfect representation of Jesus. Jesus Christ of Nazareth can change your life. You may build cathedrals, great and small, but only what you do for Christ will last. Let me tell you something. Some folks would rather have houses and land. Some folks choose silver and gold. These things they treasure and forget about their souls. But as for Dewey Smith, I have decided to make Jesus my choice. Make him yours today. I promise you, he'll change your entire life. You've been watching The Absolute Necessary. Thank you for your time. I love you so much. And God does too. Hear me well. You are so unbelievably loved by God. God freaking loves you unbelievably.